Everyone knows therapy is great for solving problems, but getting therapy has its own problems too, like finding the right therapist, fitting into their schedule, and of course, the cost. Well, BetterHelp can solve those problems. It's totally online and built around your schedule. It's surprisingly affordable too. Connect with a credentialed therapist by phone, video, or online chat, all from the comfort of your home. Visit BetterHelp.com to learn more and save 10% on your first month. That's BetterHelp, H-E-L-P.
History as it happens, June 20th, 2024. Myanmar on the brink.
For 3 years, the nation of 54 million people has been embroiled in an escalating civil war between the military junta and hundreds of pro-democracy militias, ethnic armies, and local defense forces.
The military government is saying it has pardoned 3,300 prisoners and moved former leader Aung San Suu Kyi from prison to house arrest.
Rebel forces there are fighting an intense battle against the military regime. Press freedom in the country is restricted. Hundreds of journalists have been jailed.
Since the new conscription laws came into force, thousands of young men and women have come down into the jungles to join the pro-democracy forces. They'd rather fight against the military junta than join their ranks.
Since achieving its independence in 1948, Burma, now Myanmar, has spent decades under military rule. Its people joining ethnic armies at war with the state. Pro-democracy activists are being jailed, tortured, and murdered. The current war now in its fourth year after the junta toppled a democratically elected government. It doesn't receive as much attention in the U.S. as other wars where democracy is said to be on the line. But we're going to tackle it next as we report history as it happens. A podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
This is not Ne Win's army. This is a very different army than the one that existed when I was there 25 years ago. And they have been perverted by the current General Min Aung Hlaing. He's just a corrupt, vicious person, and he refuses to give up power. He's even losing the support of some of the senior generals around him.
You know, I've done about 350 episodes of this podcast, and this is the first time I'm talking about the ongoing insurgency and civil war in Burma, or Myanmar, as the country's military leaders changed the name in 1989, a year after they suppressed a pro-democracy uprising. As the Associated Press reported, in the late 1980s, Burma was an international pariah, desperate for any way to improve its image. Hoping for a sliver of international legitimacy, it said it was discarding a name handed down from its colonial past and to foster ethnic unity. The old name, officials said, excluded the country's many ethnic minorities. Now, those minorities are at war with the ruling military junta today, a war sparked by the toppling of the democratically elected Aung San Suu Kyi in a coup in February 2021. She is a champion of Myanmar's pro-democracy movement. She was detained in 1989, spent more than 15 years in prison and under house arrest until her release in 2010. That was around the time Myanmar began its difficult transition toward free elections. This war is one of the world's bloodiest, producing headlines such as this one from Reuters. Tens of thousands of Muslim minority Rohingya are feared to be caught in fighting in western Myanmar. Or this one from the AP. 6 months into an offensive against Myanmar's military government, opposition forces have made massive gains, but civilian casualties are rising sharply as regime troops increasingly turn towards scorched earth tactics in the Southeast Asian country's bitter civil war. And this from the New York Times. Thousands of innocent people killed, tens of thousands more pro-democracy protesters locked up. The return of military rule has wreaked havoc in Myanmar, and now the junta is growing increasingly brutal as a rebel uprising has gained ground in the countryside. So it would be wrong to say the war is not receiving global attention.
It is complicated, but the country's transition to democracy was cut short 3 years ago by a military coup, with the elected government led by the Nobel...
A revolution is rising across Myanmar, hidden from the world by its remoteness.
As much as 2/3 of Myanmar may now be under the control of the resistance. Some people have taken up arms against the military, but others, including...
It's simply not as important, it seems, to American audiences as ongoing conflicts in Ukraine and Israel, where democracy and the rules-based order are invoked by decision-makers and commentators on all sides. Well, the people of Myanmar are fighting for self-determination too, in a country where democracy has barely existed. So I thought a good place to start would be in 1948, the year war-torn Burma won its independence from Great Britain.
New Delhi joined in greeting Burma's Independence Day at a ceremony attended by Earl Mountbatten, India's Governor-General. In Rangoon itself, 4:20 a.m. was the hour fixed by Burmese astrologers as the most auspicious time for the transfer of power.
By 1962, a military government was in charge, and military rule would last into the next century. Writing in Foreign Affairs, the official publication of the Council on Foreign Relations, the crisis group's Richard Horsey says Myanmar is undergoing fragmentation. Large parts of the country, including most of Myanmar's international borders, are now under the dominion of various ethnic armed groups. These groups are expanding control of their ethnic homelands and building autonomous statelets. But this does not necessarily mean the country's headed for a catastrophic collapse with the kind of chaotic intergroup violence that has played out in other fractured states such as Yugoslavia in the 1990s. So do yourself a favor and open a map of Myanmar and you'll see another reason why we don't see too much of what's going on there. It is not an easy place to get to, topographically speaking. It is adjacent to India, Bangladesh, China, and Thailand. Priscilla Clapp was once stationed there. As part of her 30-year career at the U.S. State Department, Clapp served as Chief of Mission and Permanent Chargé d'Affaires at the U.S. Embassy in Burma from 1999 to 2002. She is now a senior advisor to the U.S. Institute of Peace here in Washington. We're going to talk about Myanmar and her recent work at USIP investigating Southeast Asia's scam industry. I never knew about this. It involves Myanmar, and it is victimizing Americans online to the tune of billions of dollars. Priscilla Clapp, welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here.
And thank you for all your years of foreign service for the United States of America. You've been in many places, Japan, South Africa, Moscow. We're going to talk about Burma or Myanmar. We're actually going to talk about what to call the country. Let's just start, though, by how you wound up there and why you weren't able to be confirmed as an ambassador because of the nature of the government in the country at the time.
Well, I wound up there because I was in the Foreign Service. And the Foreign Service decided that they wanted me to become the chief of mission in Rangoon. My previous Asian experience had been in Japan, and there is actually a connection between Japan and Burma, which I will get into later.
Sure.
Anyway, so I went out there under assignment from the State Department, and they assigned me to the ambassador's position there. But ambassadors have to be confirmed by the Congress in order to present U.S. credentials to the government. And Congress had ordained before that they would not confirm an ambassador to Burma because of the harsh military government. It was one of the sanctions. And they didn't allow a Burmese ambassador to be posted to Washington. So there was reciprocity there. So I went out in the ambassador position, but I had to be called Chargé d'Affaires or Chief of Mission. And so that's the title that I carried while I was there. And the same thing happened to the Burmese representation in Washington.
Washington still calls the country Burma. 1989, actually, is when the military leaders of Burma changed the name to Myanmar after they had brutally suppressed a pro-democracy uprising. So we can't cover the entire history of the country in a relatively short podcast, but we're going to do our best. I think it's smart to start in 1948 because that is when Burma wins its independence from the British. The British ruled Burma from 1824 to 1948, as mentioned. There were 3 Anglo-Burmese wars. 1948, the country actually starts with a parliamentary democracy, right?
It does. But let me go back a little bit to the colonial period. And also, you have to understand that Burma was occupied by Japan during World War II for several years. And there was a brutal, brutal war in the country. The Allied forces, the British, the US, and Australians and others fought to get the Japanese out of the country. And they had help from the Burmese army to do that. And the army at that time was headed by General Aung San, who was the father of Aung San Suu Kyi, the democracy heroine.
The Burma Road, right? We had to keep the Burma Road open.
Burma Road,
General
that's
Stilwell.
right. And flying the hump between India and China. So the country at the end of World War II was devastated. And because of the confusion in the country during the Japanese occupation and World War II, lots and lots of militias had developed in the country. It was a mess. So the country that the new government inherited in 1948 was not in any way united. They call themselves the Rangoon government because Rangoon was about the only place that they had any control. Years and years of insurgency followed that. At one point, the insurgency was supported by Mao Zedong from China, and it became a massive communist insurgency. So in the 1950s, when they had their first democratic government, and it was, as you say, a parliamentary democracy, they couldn't really handle all the conflict in the country. So the army, which started out as a very small rump of an army, started to grow and grow. And General Ne Win became the head of the army during the 50s. And General Ne Win began to fight the insurgencies quite successfully and expand the space that the government controlled over the country. And he did this by requisitioning almost all of the resources of the country to the army and grew the army. He also purified the army so that he got the other ethnic groups that had been part of the army before out and made it a Burma. Burma is the majority ethnic group in the country. He made it a Burma army, and it has remained that until today. When the British had ruled the country during the colonial period, they had allowed the major ethnic groups on the periphery of the country, in the Kachin state, the Shan state, and the western part of the country, to be semi-autonomous and rule themselves by their own ethnic leaders because they were very different ethnicities. In fact, the British defined 135 different ethnicities in the country, which was a mistake. They shouldn't have defined them at all. At any rate, it is one of the most ethnically diverse countries in the world, and there are probably as many as 36 different languages. At the end of the war, you had this enormous mess, and Ne Win stepped in and started making order out of the mess, and he was celebrated for that. In the meantime, the parliament developed two major factions. It was the one party split into two factions. One faction was liberal and the other faction was highly nationalistic. One faction supported the Prime Minister U Nu. The other faction supported the military general Ne Win. In 1962, Ne Win was fed up with all of the fighting in the parliament, and he just took over in a military coup. And he was celebrated for doing that because it suddenly created order. The streets became safe, things started to work, the trains were moving, and so people welcomed this coup in certain ways.
Yeah. You mentioned the brief period of parliamentary democracy does end in 1962, and General Ne Win holds power for 26 years until 1989. So during this period...
No, 88.
88, okay. During this period, what state was the country in, or to borrow some Cold War terminology? Was Burma aligned with the West or the USSR?
Burma has always prided itself on neutrality. It was a founding member of the non-aligned movement, proudly. And so they were distancing themselves between China and Russia, who were enemies at that time, and the West, because of their colonial experience. So he had sets of relations with all three, particularly balancing between China and Russia, or the Soviet Union at the time, because they were the two that had the most influence. And he leaned more towards the Soviet Union because it was less intrusive than the Chinese. And the Chinese, as I told you, were supporting the communist rebellion in Burma. So he had to be very careful, but he never made an enemy of China. He treated it very carefully, but he definitely went after the communist insurgencies. There were a lot of PLA that had been, the Chinese army, that had been inserted into the insurgent groups on the border. So the Burma army at that time was actually fighting Chinese. And they remembered that up until the time that I was there. Most of the generals in the army when I was there had actually fought the PLA, the Chinese, during this insurgency. So they had a very healthy disrespect or I would say fear of China.
Massive protests break out in the late 1980s under General Ne Win. What motivated these protests?
Well, General Ne Win had created a socialist government. It was a single-party socialist government. So it actually had a parliament, but only one party. And he ruled the party, and most of the ministers and senior people were military, ex-military. So it was very much a military socialist government. It did a terrible job of managing the economy. And when the World Bank announced that it was one of the least developed countries in the world, the people were horrified because they always thought of themselves as being an advanced developed country in Southeast Asia, as it had been at the time of independence. It was one of the wealthiest countries, despite the chaos. So when they saw that it was ranked least developed, they rebelled, basically economic reasons, but they said, we want to return to multi-party democracy. Ne Win was frustrated. He threw up his hands, and one day he just stood up and he said, all those guys in my government have created this mess. I'm fed up with it. I'm resigning. And he stepped down, just like that, in August of 1988. And he left the government in the hands of a general who was the one that started mowing people down on the streets.
3,000 people were killed in August 1988 in a vicious crackdown by the army. There are echoes, of course, today. So a new junta, Junta, I'm going to pronounce that word correctly for the rest of my life from this point forward, takes over in 1989, and they change the country's name from the Union of Burma to the Union of Myanmar, with the capital of Rangoon. Was this new military leadership any different or better than the previous one?
It was a continuity of the previous one.
Okay.
This was an internal military coup. The first order that they made was, we will return to multi-party parliament and we will have elections. We will have multi-party elections. That then pacified the people. That's what they wanted. So then they went about organizing an election. Now, this is at the time that Aung San Suu Kyi, General Aung San's daughter, appeared on the scene. She was at that time married to a British professor at Oxford. She had been living in England for quite a long time. She came back because her mother wasn't well, and she happened to be there when rebellion broke out, and she became the one who led the crowds in standing up to the generals. So they revered her for being so brave. And she got very active in the elections, and there were lots of teeny little parties formed. And this was what the military wanted, so that their own party would have the majority and the teeny parties would not. But she managed to organize a lot of the small parties into one large party called the National League for Democracy. And she had as her basic advisors and senior people in the party ex-generals, ex-military, who had fallen out with Ne Win and quit. So it was a very credible organization that she put together. The military then became concerned about the power of this new party, so they put her in detention. She was not allowed to run in the elections in 1990. The elections that they had promised were held in 1990. But nonetheless, her party, NLD, the National League for Democracy, won an overwhelming majority in the election. The military were shocked, and they didn't know what to do. So they said, well, we don't have a new constitution, so we're going to have to form a constitutional convention and work on a constitution. And they only allowed the majority party, the NLD, to have a few seats in this convention. So it was controlled by the military. And Aung San Suu Kyi was in detention. And they started putting many more people into detention. So things really started breaking down.
Wow. Why would the military, through all these years, feel like it needs to hold on to power? In many countries, the military, for economic reasons, there's any number of interests that might drive military leaders to not want to cede power.
Well, this is derived from the experience of World War II and the immediate post-World War period when the country was beset by conflict and rebellion. And when Ne Win pulled it together, people realized that it was going to take a strong army to hold the country together, a strong centralized army. And the majority population being Burma, they said, it's even better if that strong centralized army is Burma, because we need to control all of these unruly minor ethnic groups.
Because like today, these minority ethnic groups, they have their own armies. They're operating almost statelets. They simply want autonomy, right? They don't want to be controlled by a central government. And they exist on the periphery of the country, on the borders with China, India, Thailand, right?
It's a little more complicated than that, but these armies that you refer to grew out of the original insurgency. Because when the military finally came to agreement with them, they concluded a series of ceasefires. And this was during the 80s and 90s with the Kachin, the major groups that had been fighting them. They no longer were communist anymore. They were just ethnic. They had shed the communist shell. But they had several of these, quite a few of them, probably as many as 15 to 17. They formulated ceasefires with them. This is after Ne Win stepped down. Under these ceasefires, they gave the armies control of the territory because they had formed 7 ethnic states and 7 Burma states. And so there were these ethnic states that they could control. And most of the country's really valuable natural resources are in these ethnic areas.
Okay.
And the military wanted to get into that. So they formed corporations and agreements with the ethnic groups to do business together. And that was the essence of the ceasefires.
These complexities remind me a little bit of the situation in Yugoslavia, trying to make a country out of all these different ethnic groups who don't necessarily want to live in one unitary state. So by 2007, there's something called the Saffron Revolution, widespread anti-government protests sparked by fuel price hikes and other problems.
It didn't just come out of nowhere. When they started holding the convention, the Constitutional Convention, they said, we're going to come up with a new constitution and that will lead to elections. They spent 20 years working on this constitution. And in 2007, they were nearing the completion of that process, although there'd been a lot of minor protests in between. But the 2007 protest, as you say, came about because of economic conditions, really bad economic conditions, and military inability to manage the economy properly. So the people were protesting that, but they were also anti-military. There's no question that there were anti-military protests. And as that protest was going on, the military was concluding the final chapters of this new constitution and bringing it to a committee to write the constitution itself. And they finally brought the rebellion, the 2007 rebellion, under control in just a couple of months. But we called it the Saffron Revolution because it had been propelled by monks. In Burma, the monks wear saffron-colored robes. And so it was the monks protesting against the military, the monks siding with the people against the military. And they had previously been aligned with the military. So it was a sign that the military really needed to move forward. They had also joined ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. They had begun to interact with their neighbors in a completely new way. And the generals had been able to travel to these other countries, and they could see that their country was woefully behind economically. They were not keeping up with their neighbors. So they knew they had to change. ASEAN, after the Saffron Revolution, was pressing them to move ahead with this plan that they had been talking about. So in early 2008, they came up with a new constitution, and they were bringing that to a referendum just as Cyclone Nargis hit in May of 2008.
Eventually, the military leaders do relinquish some power. They approved some changes in 2011 that produced what was called the military-dominated civilian parliament.
No, the election was in 2010.
2010, okay.
This constitution that they came up with...
That took 20 years to write.
It took 20 years to write. It had the bones of a democratic government, but it had a whole lot of catch-22s built into it that kept the military essentially in control of both the political and the economic aspects of the country.
Levers, yeah.
But it created a veneer of democracy. Also created the ability for people to participate in a parliamentary government. That's another important piece of history here. The president and major ministers were all military or ex-military because they were appointed even before the government took over. They realized that they weren't going to succeed in making friends in order to get the investment that they needed. So they made a deal with basically Western nations, particularly the United States. And it was sort of a transactional deal in 2011 that if they released political prisoners, if they released Aung San Suu Kyi, and they started allowing the NLD to join this new parliament, that, step by step, we would begin easing sanctions and expanding our relations and opening markets for them. And so that happened in 2011. And there was a lot of excitement in the international community that there was real reform going on because the new president, even though he was ex-military, was reform-minded. So a lot of things started happening. In 2012, they held interim elections in order to fill empty seats in the parliament that had been created when they moved people into the executive branch. They invited Aung San Suu Kyi and the NLD to run in that parliament, in that election, and they took all but one of the seats.
You mentioned the president.
Thein Sein.
Thein Sein.
Thein Sein.
Yeah, he did spearhead some reforms. We're talking about this 2011-2010 period. He granted amnesty to political prisoners. He relaxed media censorship. He implemented economic policies to encourage, as you mentioned, foreign investment. But then we do get what we should consider the first real elections. I mean, they're not multi-party elections if you're not allowing all the parties in. So in 2015...
Those were the first free and fair elections.
Yeah. She wins. Her party wins.
They won a landslide.
But we know what happened in 2021. There was a coup.
Well, there were other elections in November of 2020. To the surprise of the military, the NLD, Aung San Suu Kyi's party, won even larger landslide and even more control over the parliament. And her government, she had headed the government for 5 years, and during that period had started making some significant reforms that were not necessarily recognized by the international community, but particularly economic reforms, and they were beginning to hurt the military control of the economy. That was some of the impetus behind the coup.
Do you view her years in power as a success? Was she an able administrator?
She was not an experienced administrator, but she grew in the position. However, mistakes that she made were never forgiven outside the country. She still was a heroine, whatever, inside the country. But the international community began to skewer her over the Rohingya issue.
That's right.
And she was blamed for the military attack on the Rohingya.
Which has been called a genocide by some observers.
Well, it was not a genocide because there are still many, many Rohingya. It was ethnic cleansing, what it was.
Was she really responsible for this?
She had no way of stopping it. Let's just put it that way. She didn't have any way of stopping it. And because she refused to lash out at the military afterwards because it would have brought a coup right away, she was blamed for it afterwards. And she went to the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, when a suit was brought against the country for genocide. She went to that hearing to defend the country. And she actually, in the course of the hearing, said that the military probably committed acts against humanity. I can't remember the terminology, but she, in effect, was blaming the military for what happened. But that was sort of ignored. The fact that she went and defended the country was taken as a defense of the military. That's unfortunate, but at any rate, she had to live with that.
So the coup in 2021, we are now 4 years into this civil war that has many fronts during which the military has committed a number of atrocities and acts of terror against civilians. Do you feel like what's happening there is receiving enough attention, especially at this moment in world politics when we talk often about the fate of democracy and freedom for people to realize their national aspirations? And we're dealing with a lot of pro-democracy protesters who are being jailed and tortured in the country there.
In my opinion, of course, it's not getting enough attention, but that's in the West. It's getting a lot of attention in Asia. I regularly read the Asian press. It's getting more attention now in the West. But the dilemma here is that what's going on there, we cannot easily do anything about. The country is closed. The military has shut it off from the international world, and its neighbors have essentially cordoned it off as well. So it's not something where you can get in. Even the UN is under the control of the junta. They have to approve anything that they do in the country has to be approved by the junta. And so international governments have had to reduce their contributions to the UN for humanitarian assistance because it goes astray the minute it gets into the country. And we're using informal channels to get it into the hands of the people that really need it now, and not through international organizations. So you don't see a record of assistance or activity going into the country. I am personally involved, along with a lot of others, in regular communications with the resistance, with many different parts of the resistance, and they are getting a lot of attention and support quietly from the outside. But there's really nothing positive that could be done by international intervention at this point, because the military is absolutely determined to maintain its control of the country, but it doesn't have control anymore. So they're lashing out and, in effect, destroying all of the civilian population, except in the very middle of the country.
Well, that's right. They're building even more prisons now to lock more protesters away. So we mentioned the 2021 coup, but the military never consolidated its control over the country and is now fighting a number of ethnic armies that operate along the periphery of Burma. These armed groups operate what are called statelets, and one possible solution that has been discussed is to create a federal system where you have a weak central government and virtual autonomy for these armed groups.
The resistance has formed what they call a National Unity Government, NUG, and that consists of a combination of Burma, ex-politicians and ex-leaders, and several ethnic leaders. Kachin, Karen, Karenni, and Chin, we call it the K3C, are members of this NUG. And it is also allied in more informally with all of the other major resistance armies and resistance groups. Each army also has its civilian side. So they are, in effect, little governments in a way. And because of the ceasefires that they formed during the 80s and 90s, these armies were able to actually develop into real armies. They are well equipped, they are well trained, they have long histories, and they are formidable. But they have been winning battles by joining together. They were never allowed to join together in the earlier period because the military knew that if they allowed them to join together, they wouldn't be able to fight them. So they managed to keep their battles with them bilateral, one-on-one, and keep them off balance. But this coup set them off, and they began coordinating through some platforms that were developed by the NUG and others. They have coordinated a 360-degree assault on the military, and they have taken over all of the country's borders with Thailand, China, India, and Bangladesh. The military no longer runs any border crossings. They no longer have any access to border trade, which is a major part of the economy. The economy is falling apart. The country is falling apart. And the military, when it sends ground troops in to fight, they lose many, many people.
Are you surprised by that, at how poorly the military's performed?
Not really, because there's tremendous disaffection in the military. The morale is very low. They're treated very badly. They're treated about the same way they treat prisoners. The fighting troops on the bottom are really treated badly. And if they don't perform well, they get shot.
My gosh.
So It's pretty brutal. This is not Ne Win's army. This is a very different army than the one that existed when I was there 25 years ago. And they have been perverted by the current General Min Aung Hlaing. He's just a corrupt, vicious person, and he refuses to give up power. He's even losing the support of some of the senior generals around him.
So what does China, or what do China, India, Thailand, how do they feel about these statelets run by ethnic armies on their borders?
Well, they're concerned about disintegration. They're concerned about failing state, that somehow Burma would become a failed state. But most of them don't understand the complexities of power inside the country. And they haven't got a real understanding of what the resistance is all about or what kinds of organizations that exist in the resistance.
Are you worried about Burma fragmenting a la Yugoslavia 1990s, breaking apart totally?
Not really. It's not so much like a Yugoslavia, because there are lots of relations, and these groups have already developed negotiating channels. So when they have differences, they negotiate solutions. They are determined for autonomy at this point, some degree of autonomy, but they have all signed on to the idea of a federal democracy where you would have states, a series of states, and a central government, but the central government would not have the power and control that the military has had, and there would be no military in political control. Military would be confined to military issues.
Yeah. I just want to share something that Richard Horsey, who's an expert on Burma, wrote for Foreign Affairs, which is the official publication of the Council on Foreign Relations. He says here, what these groups, the armed groups, seek is the establishment of permanent ethnic homelands, in some cases explicitly modeled on Wa State, a self-ruling enclave on the Chinese border. The process of state building at the regional level makes progress toward federalism at the national level more challenging. He says these groups aim to maintain their armies, to safeguard their autonomy, and in some cases preserve control over lucrative natural resources. You made that point before. But he says there's a big obstacle to a federal solution, and that is that these ethnic minority administrations don't want to cede any of their power to a national government. Do you agree with him?
Not completely, no, because he's lumping them all together. And they're not all the same, and they don't all have the same ambitions or the same understanding of where they want to come out. There's going to be a very long process of working out the solution once they get beyond the conflict, and I do believe that the resistance will eventually prevail. Once they get beyond the conflict, they're going to have to spend years negotiating all of these differences. First, there's going to be border questions about who controls what state, because in the course of the fighting, some of the ethnic armies have moved into other places beyond their own territory and been fighting in hand with the Burma PDFs, People's Defense Forces. There's actually mixed armies fighting this war, and they have developed platforms communicating, mediating differences, and lots of things that certainly didn't exist in Yugoslavia. As they move through the conflict, I've seen some of them move away from the idea of a strict autonomous state, because they're going to find that it's really difficult to deal with the outside world if they're little autonomous states. They don't have the power to do that. Governments are not going to recognize them. They already have trouble managing the borders that they've taken over. The Chinese do not want to trade officially through any of those border points with a local entity.
Yeah, I mean, think about that, right? It would be like if some little town in Canada, north of the border, seceded or something and established trade relations with the United States. And India apparently used to allow people from one border region to move freely back and forth between Burma and India, but now they're building a 1,000-mile border fence. That does not sound like a good idea. But
it's not very effective. The Chinese did that too, and that's not effective.
Is there an end in sight? How do we bring about an end to the fighting so we can set up a federal system?
No, there's not an end in sight at this point. There's going to have to be some kind of probably black swan event. I can't tell you what it will be, but Min Aung Hlaing, the head general, has to go. When they figure out how to get him out, there'll be sort of a recalibration of whether they should move into discussions about the future, all of the sides. And I can't predict when or how that will happen. As I said, this NUG has already developed some very detailed plans for future governance in the country that includes a combination of autonomy with some form of central authority.
Does the U.S. have any influence there to try to bring peace about?
Well, once we get to that point, U.S. will be engaged, absolutely. But we're not at that point now because Min Aung Hlaing absolutely refuses to engage on anything other than a return to military control. He insists that the only route forward for him is continued military control and his plan.
You obviously care about the country very much.
But I would tell you that these ethnic armies are now extremely powerful because as they have conquered the military, they've been taking their weapons. So they have tanks, armored vehicles, artillery, all of these things that they took from the military. They're very well equipped.
So, Priscilla Clapp of the U.S. Institute of Peace, you have issued a report on transnational crime in Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia's fraud factories. Cyber scamming that is costing everyday Americans billions of dollars per year, according to the report. So, I'm totally unfamiliar with this. Who are these people and how are they able to scam American citizens?
Well, there are three basic forms. One of them is online gambling, where you think that you're gambling legitimately and you find out that you never win. The money just goes. And they make you do this in cryptocurrency. So you have to take your own hard-earned cash, convert it into cryptocurrency, their crypto, and it just goes into who knows what.
So it's like an online, you're playing online games and they just never, you never come up.
Yeah.
The dice always come up.
Stuck. You just keep playing thinking you're going to win it back. It doesn't work. That's the gambling part. But the two other ones are really scams. One of them is an investment scam based on cryptocurrency. They come at you and say, I've got a great investment for you. And I've received some, even over Signal, I've been getting some messages from people saying, we've got this great crypto investment group. Would you like to join us? This is a scam. As I said, you have to change your money into crypto. And in doing that, you may inadvertently give them access to your bank account. They will empty it. Once you change it into crypto, it never comes back. And people keep investing more and more of thinking that they're going to get it back, but it doesn't happen. The other is sort of dating scams. They come at you and get you into a personal relationship, and you start handing over money either for investment or for some hard luck story or whatever. But mostly it's for investment. And you get drawn into this personal relationship and you begin to invest in it emotionally. And it's very hard to get out of it, but you wind up losing enormous amounts of money. People are losing millions of dollars. People are being wiped out. They particularly go after older people who have pension funds.
Oh, boy.
And they just wipe them out. The U.S. is already losing billions of dollars. But these fraud factories, the epicenter is Burma, Cambodia, and Laos. Now, those three countries, Burma is almost ungoverned. It's border guard forces under the military that have been hosting these scams, not running them, but hosting them. But they're run by Chinese criminals, overseas Chinese criminals. And the Chinese, mainland Chinese, and Chinese even in the diaspora are among the biggest victims because they started out scamming Chinese, but they're now moving to scam globally. And they've taken a lot of young people hostage into these scam centers to run the scams. And they hold them there at gunpoint with bars on the windows and everything and force them to produce a certain amount of income. If they don't produce it, they get beaten.
Apparently, well, you mentioned this is billions with a B. This money is now being, the political elites in the country are skimming off the top, right? Reading from the report, the political and economic elites of Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar are intertwined with this scam industry. It cannot grow to account for a third of GDP without patronage from influential people. No self-respecting Cambodian or Laotian elite would not want a piece of this pie, the report says. So, that would explain why these countries aren't stopping criminal activity within their own borders.
If you look at the Thai border, all along the Thai border for about 60 or 70 kilometers, there are cities, whole cities of high-rises that are just scam centers. And they've all come up in just the last few years.
That's amazing. I'd like to think that I'm too smart to be scammed, but these guys must be pretty sophisticated.
They are. They're very sophisticated, but they're technically sophisticated. They have created new ways of using advanced technology to, first of all, capture this forced labor that they use. Second of all, to capture the victims of the scamming. Third of all, to launder the money. They are laundering billions. In the study, we cite an annual figure of multiple billions of dollars, but it's probably well beyond $100 billion a year being made off this type of scamming worldwide. It's all getting laundered into the formal financial system. And so it's a threat, a major threat globally.
Explain then why this is a national security interest to the United States.
It's destabilizing in a lot of ways. First of all, with our own population, when you have our own population being scammed at this rate, it's very destabilizing. But it has international implications because of the way that they capture elites in all of these other countries. The money is going into military activity. It's going into a lot of other malign activity, including drug trafficking, prostitution. All of these things go along with the scams.
Yeah, your report says this industry could soon rival fentanyl as one of the top dangers that Chinese criminal networks pose to the United States. Is this the Chinese mafia or is it something else?
Well, they're called the triad. Triads are an ancient Chinese secret society that dates way, way, way back into the early centuries in China. They've played different roles at different times, but during the Mao period, they didn't like them because they embraced free commerce, and that was anti-communist. But now they see them as a threat to China itself. They're run by people that still have ties to China, and some of the Chinese go after some of them and not after others. Because of their ability to capture the elites in these other countries, the Chinese become wary of taking them down and making enemies in countries that they want to control. And it's also mixed in with the Belt and Road Initiative. It's very complicated. The Chinese are starting to take some very strong law enforcement measures, but it's selective. What we are recommending in the study is that the international community really needs to coordinate a response to this. You can't treat it piecemeal. You can't go country by country because when they see law enforcement coming in one country, they move to another one. They're infinitely flexible. They can move very easily because it is a network. They're connected. And they're connected in something called Hongmen, which is basically another name for the Triad organization. But the Triads have existed quite a long time in the overseas Chinese community because they serve a social function for Chinese immigrants in these countries. It helps them stabilize, keep their families going, get into business. They do a whole combination of both perfectly legitimate business and illegitimate.
And I will share a link to the U.S. IP report on transnational crime in Southeast Asia in my weekly newsletter. You can sign up at historyasithappens.com, or you can find me on Substack. Just search for History As It Happens. And on the next episode of History As It Happens podcast, Sergei Radchenko and Vladislav Zubak are returning to discuss Radchenko's new book, To Run the World, a new history of Soviet foreign policy, its motivations, its aims, the role of ideology versus what you might call more realist concerns. And what I learned in this book, all 760 some odd pages, I can apply to what's going on today. What motivates decision makers? That's next as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.
For the ones who work hard to ensure their crew can always go the extra mile, and the ones who get in early so everyone can go home on time, there's Grainger, offering professional-grade supplies backed by product experts so you can quickly and easily find what you need. Plus, you can count on access to a committed team ready to go the extra mile for you. Call, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.